the title of the course is Who Wrote the Bible? So if not, if you're registered for a different class, look for another Zoom. I didn't make it up, but in some ways I'm going to be following this text, Who Wrote the Bible, by Richard Elliott Friedman, who was he's now an emeritus professor of University of California at San Diego, but I believe he is spending some years at University of Georgia. So people who want to catch his lectures, plus he's on YouTube and whatever. That the book, in many ways, was his his dissertation at Harvard, doctoral dissertation, and with that, I guess either he decided or somebody said, you could just edit that and make it into a popular book, and so he has. And the story that my favorite story that I've never met him, at least not that I know of. When I've seen videos of him, I said, gee, I think I've seen him somewhere, but it might be because I saw him on a previous video. But the story that I like to tell about him is, well, let me start that with Who Wrote the Bible. Depending upon who you are and your religious beliefs, that it can be, oh, wow, or it could be, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, keep it away from me. I even know students who have enrolled at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which by my standards is a pretty mainstream Jewish organization, and they drop out of school because they can't believe at the Jewish Theological Seminary they teach about the documentary hypothesis, which hopefully if you read the articles, you'll get a sense of the documentary hypothesis. And so they dropped out. And it's, look, you gotta be in a school and you gotta be in a class where you're comfortable. And obviously they weren't, and they enrolled someplace else. And so it goes. For me, I suppose I first heard about the documentary hypothesis when I was in Hebrew high school. That I was fortunate I know many of you know most of my biography, so some of it I'll repeat and some of it will be new, that in the Boston area, there was a regional Hebrew high school. You had the option of going to the synagogue high school, or there was also a regional Hebrew high school. And the regional Hebrew high school, for people who know the Boston area, when I went there, the original, no, I suppose predating me. For those of you who read the book, The Making of the President, the various Making of the President books by Theodore White, I think his first one was with in 1960, that Theodore White was probably the most famous of the graduates of our Hebrew high school. It was a regional Hebrew high school. It was originally in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston, not far from the Franklin Park Zoo. And then in the early 1960s, they moved to Brookline, Massachusetts, just off of Beacon Street, not far from Kenmore Square. If you know people who have been to the BU campus, and you say, oh, I know Kenmore Square, that's where Fenway Park and the BU campus are. And then I think sometime in the 1980s, they moved from Brookline to Newton Center. And in part, that was all because that was the geography of the center of Boston's Jewish community. Anyway, that the Hebrew high school had a summer school that you could either, it had two summer schools, one that was located at a camp in New Hampshire, and another was located in the school in Brookline. My parents were willing, let me do whatever I wanted, but they basically did push for the idea of my going to the Hebrew high school summer school so that I wouldn't have to take a full set of courses during the course of the year. And you say, full set of courses? How much is this Hebrew high school? The Hebrew high school was a 10-hour-a-week program where you took 2 hours on Sunday morning and 2 hours on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday afternoons. It was a pretty intense program for a Hebrew high school. And that's one of the reasons why it was a regional Hebrew high school, that most synagogues didn't have the resources to teach something like that. But it was expected that when you graduated the Hebrew high school, that you would have a pretty good background. And I would say, for what it's worth, when I enrolled at NYU, and that I had some credits from the Hebrew high school, that they told me, go speak to such and such a professor if to see if it would account for advanced credit, advanced placement. And I did. And I just started to tell my biography. I probably got 2 paragraphs out, and he said, give me a minute. I got to write a letter to the dean. And he wrote a letter to the dean saying that that my Hebrew high school program was equivalent to most courses that a university would teach on the freshman and sophomore level. So it was an intense program. And so if you went to either the summer school or you went to summer camp, you could get 1 or 2 days off. You could make it into a 4-day-a-week program instead, or a 3-day-a-week program instead of a 5-day-a-week program. Anyway, at the summer school, they usually would have teachers, not the regular teachers, but people who were either in rabbinical school and were looking for a little tuition money. So they were teaching at the Hebrew high school, or they were people who were in Boston working on a doctoral thesis of their own, usually at Harvard or Brandeis, and they would teach the class. And they always thought it was wonderful teaching these high school kids about the documentary hypothesis. But obviously they had my ear and the ear of many of the students in the class. And so I pass it along. Obviously, I got it at a relatively early age. So back to the story about Richard Friedman. Shortly after he finished the book, that, you know, as you've seen on TV, that you write a book, you go on TV or on the lecture circuit, or you go to Barnes and Noble and autograph books because you want to sell the book. And so that shortly after the book was out and published, that he had a night on the old Larry King radio show. I know sometimes people remember him from CNN, but before he was on CNN, he had a nationally syndicated radio show where he'd have guests and he'd question the guests the same way he did it on TV. And one night he had Richard Elliott Friedman talking about who wrote the Bible. Figured that would be great for a national audience. Well, my guess is that Larry King had a very religiously conservative audience, or certainly that night, because I would say, I didn't keep track of the calls, but I would say a good 9 out of 10 calls were people, I suspect most of them Christians, that Richard Friedman himself is Jewish. I know you might wonder from the name, so you might as well know, even though he was never strongly affiliated with the Jewish community. And you had a number of these religiously conservative Christians who were lambasting him from the moment they got it. It was like, you know, hi, Larry, how you doing? And he'd say, hi, you're on the phone with Richard Friedman. And he'd say, yeah, I want to give him a piece of my mind. How dare he say this stuff? How dare he write this stuff? This is blasphemy. You know, how could he do this sort of thing? I can't. And he said, Larry, I'm even a little surprised. I know you have a controversial show, but sometimes there are things that are just beyond the bounds. Somebody who's writing a book about who wrote the Bible, you should know who wrote the Bible. God wrote the Bible. It's as simple as that. Everybody knows that. It's common. And so, as I said, that was 9 out of 10 calls. The other thing that I remember about that night is it was a summer night and I was visiting my parents on Cape Cod. And on Cape Cod, you don't want to listen to the local stations at night. Maybe during the day, you get a little news, you get a little music. But at night, it's usually a rerun of something else. And so if you're lucky, you can tune in to either the Boston or the New York stations. And I know New York is geographically a lot farther away, but the fact that there is the Long Island, the water between Long Island and New England, you can usually catch some of the New York stations. And I
Long
think
Island Sound.
Long Island Sound. Thank you, Bob. You can catch, WINS. You can catch WCBS. You can catch WOR, and I think it was on WOR at that time. I'm not 100% sure. But that night, there was a thunderstorm coming through the Cape. And all I can remember is these calls of the callers who were lambasting him. And I don't know if anybody actually told him that he was going to burn in hell, but there was all of this lightning, and I could figure lightning and fire and brimstone, that this is the perfect setting for to listen to this night. And so that was my first exposure, particularly to Richard Elliott Friedman, but not to the documentary hypothesis. So I'd like to, I know usually I ask you folks to read, but instead I'm going to ask you some questions. And then what I'd like is, I'd like people to, I'm going to read selections from the Bible. And I'd like you to, this is like when you take the SATs. It's like, how much did you comprehend? So, and I'm only going to ask a couple of questions for each selection. So we'll see where it goes. The first selection that I'm going to read from, and people can feel free to follow. I'm going to read it, I believe, from the new JPS, the 1984 version. It's of the Jewish Publication Society. So here are my first two questions. I'm going to read about the creation of the world. Okay, we all know about all the creation. I know most people are going to say, oh, yeah. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. So you're probably going to be disappointed to begin with, because the new Jewish version doesn't start in the beginning. It begins with when God began to create. Why? It's a little more critical than in the beginning. In the beginning means in the beginning of what? In the beginning of time? If it was in the beginning of time, where does God fit in this discussion? In the beginning of time was probably as long ago as God's existence, which is infinite. So the story is speaking at a particular time when God began to create the world. And so in this translation, they don't put in the beginning because they feel it's misleading. It's not in the beginning. God was in the beginning, long before the story of Genesis. This is when God began to create. So having made that point, let me read. But first, the two questions. So here's what I want you to listen for. Question number one is, how did God create the world? Okay. And if you could shorten, anybody who wants to give an answer, not yet, but after I read, try to keep it to one or two sentences. So question number one, how did God create the world? Question number two, did God create the world? And when I say the world, let me just talk about the earth. We can talk about the solar system. We can talk about a lot of things. Let me just focus on the earth for right now. Did God create the earth remotely or working at a particular site? For instance, for those of you who have had to make gravestones, when you go to the stone maker, if it's a double stone, usually the first half of the stone is made in the factory, in the store, in the workshop. Whereas the second half of the stone, since two people usually don't die at the same time, the stone maker usually goes to the cemetery and works on site. So did God create the world remotely or on site? Third question, and then I'll leave it alone for the creation of the world. When God was creating the world, it talks about all the things God created. was God focused, or was the creation story focused on a particular place on earth? Okay. It wasn't Disney World, the happiest place on earth. I'll give you that hint. But I think there might be a hint of a focus on a particular place or area of the world. Okay, so I'm going to read. When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water. Okay, that was verses 1 and 2 from chapter 1 of Genesis, just in case you didn't recognize it, since I didn't say in the beginning. Verse 3, God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the day light, and the darkness God called night. And there was evening and there was morning, a first day. Verse 6, God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the water, that it may separate water from water. God made the expanse, and it separated the water which was below the expanse from the water which was above, God made the water which was below the expanse from the water which was above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse sky. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day. Okay, so let's go back to those questions, even though I'm not done with the story of Genesis just yet. Okay, how did God create the world? Okay. People can either, well, you can raise your hand or chat or whatever works. So who'd like that? Okay, Don, I think the first hand. Okay, how did God create the world?
You said that the world was not formed, so he couldn't be there, so he had to do it remotely.
Okay, that's my second question. Okay, so remotely. Okay, that's fine. Okay, this is one of those. I'll answer the second question first. Okay, so remotely. Okay, and how did God do it? How does the story say God did it? There aren't too many true questions yet. Okay, Fran.
I think it was day by day.
Okay, day by day. Okay, and how did God? What technique did God use? Let me put it that way. Hey, Carol, I saw a hand.
Yeah. How he's saying a phased approach.
Okay.
I mean, because really, what it says in the Bible is that, God said, let there be light, and there was light.
Right.
So it's a matter of, it's almost like he thought it and it happened.
Right. Divine fiat. God said it and it's done. Okay. Never mind as good as done. It was done. Okay. Just from the word. What we probably would like in our relation with our children. We just say it, and they do it.
Of course.
And that's why our children tell us, you're not God. So it doesn't quite work. Right. So good. And as far as the phase on the questions, right? I know I ask a question and I realize there are probably sometimes sub questions. I do with the bar and bat mitzvah kids all the time. I say, I have 3 questions for you. And about 6 questions later, they say, Rabbi, what happened to the 3 questions? I say, oh, they each had 2 parts. Okay. So the third one, was God focused on any part of the world in terms of this creation?
No.
Well, obviously it was the Middle East, right?
How? Okay. Was that you, Marlene?
That was me.
Okay. How can I assume it's the Middle East?
But we know now it was the Middle East.
We know it's the Middle East.
We know that.
All right.
I think it was Brooklyn.
Okay.
It was Bayside, New York.
Yeah, right. All right. It had to be short. This is now I could say it's New Hampshire because anybody who's been there knows that it's God's country. But anybody who's been to Sedona or the Grand Canyon, a lot of different places. Thank God there are a lot of places that you can use that expression. It's God's country. So, okay, fine. So it's like, yeah, you could argue it over. It's Brooklyn. It's the Middle East. It's Bayside. The answer is, we don't know. Okay, but I'm going to go to the second chapter of Genesis. Okay, let's see. The heaven and the earth. No, sorry. Take it back. Wrong verse. 4b. Okay. Such is the story of the heaven and earth when they were created. When the Lord God made heaven and earth, when no shrub of the field was yet on earth, and no grasses of the field yet sprouted, because the Lord God had not sent rain upon the earth, and there was no man to till the soil, but a flow would well up from the ground and water the whole surface of the earth. The Lord God formed man from the dust of the earth. He blew into the nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Let's see, do I want to keep going? Yeah, I'll go for a couple more sentences. The Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and placed there a man whom he had formed. And from the ground the Lord God caused to grow every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food, with the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and bad. So let me stop there for the minute and ask the question. Okay, in chapter 2, how did God create the world according to chapter 2? Did God say a word, a single word? It's not a trick question yet. Okay, all right, I'll take that. I'll take that shaking no. Carol is the answer. No, not a word. It's almost as though, okay, I realize this is an anthropomorphism. I apologize, but much of the Bible is that God got down on God's hands and knees and planted it. What is all this stuff? That Dawn told me it was void, it was without form. Somehow, it seems all of a sudden there's a plumbing system there, that up from the earth comes this water and waters the garden. It was underground plumbing. And obviously the underground plumbing couldn't have predated God, at least I hope not. Okay, I should be worshiping plumbers and not God. Okay, so God seems to be a little more, working with God's own hands, a little more to the point. It's not just saying it and it gets done, right? And so how did God create the world? We're not quite sure, but we know that somehow in this story in chapter 2, God is getting God's hands dirty, whether it's the plumbing or it's the soil or the planting, don't know exactly what it is. And then as far as, man, that in that previous chapter, it says, just like everything else, let's see, let's see, living creature or whatever. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And they rule the world. And God created man in his image, in the image of God. God created him male and female. Okay, it was like God said, let's do it. And the next thing you know, it's done. God created. Okay, that's a little more hands-on than the first paragraphs, but this one with God creating the soil and the plumbing and all this stuff. Okay, so my question, was this remote or was this on site? Dawn?
Rabbi, he had angels to do the work for him. He gave the orders and it was done.
Okay, I'm willing to say that in that, let us make God in our image, that God was talking to the angels. But I would say in this action stuff, it doesn't say the angels lifted a finger. it doesn't mention the angels specifically. It's just God's talking to somebody, unless God's talking to God's self. But I would say it seems to me that, God is like the way we describe the Israeli army commanders. They lead from the front, that God seems to be taking charge, which is good, because who knows if you can train, if you can trust the angels or not. So I want to take issue, Don, a little. I'm not sure, but I don't see the angels mentioned anywhere. But God seems to be everywhere, which is good, because that's part of our theology. God is everywhere. Bob.
What about supernatural?
Okay.
Supernatural forces and power. God could think it, therefore he wills it. He wills.
Okay, so it could be. We see all sorts of movies.
Excuse me. Or she
right,
wills it.
Right. Good point. We see all sorts of movies with creatures from out of. We watch Star Trek, that people can levitate, and people do all sorts. We see magicians who can do it. So it's like, gee, how do you lift that body up in Las Vegas, or slice it and dice it, and still it comes out whole? If magicians could do that, certainly God should be able to do that, which is the same story like the story of Moses in Egypt. Don, what's your question?
Rabbi, I've never really thought that God sat down and said, okay, I'm going to plant a tree here, I'll plant a tree there. I think he said, angel number 1, your job is. Angel number 2, your job is. Like any manager, you pass the responsibility of the actual doing to other people. And he said, report back to me and let me see what you did. I don't like it, we'll change it.
And if there's anything that we should be able to say about God is a good manager. Okay? As crazy as the world is, God's just leaving space for us so we can try to make ourselves feel important. Okay, but Don, and I would say, look, we have a lot of medieval rabbis who say the same thing. Okay? However, it still doesn't mention an angel in the text. It just seems God says us. I don't know who us is according to the text. God says, okay, this is going to be, and it seems to be. And here it's even less than speaking. There seems to be some action, but I'll leave it at that. All right, Don?
Rabbi, I don't think, all right, God is infinite. Okay. Can he do 50 things at the same time?
I hope so.
But I'm saying he had to do all these at the same time. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know how you can do it. Well,
okay.
I'm just a mortal.
Okay. I want to. Well, let me get one more paragraph because I want to get to that other question. Okay. Now, this is about this flow that the garden. From the ground, the Lord caused to grow every tree that was pleasing in sight and good for food, with the tree of life in the middle of the garden. We know what garden this is now if it has the tree of life, okay? Because we know how the story ends.
I said it's a place in the Middle East.
Was it Middle East? Okay, so now, see, I know, Marlene, you're always ahead of me. So here also, I was on chapter 1. I knew you were on chapter 2 already, all right? So it's the tree of knowledge, good and bad. This seals it. The tree of knowledge and the tree of life. This is it. We know this is the Garden of Eden, right? Now,
question for you, Howard here.
Is that Howie?
So, with these two different views of how God acts, were
Yes.
chapters 1 and 2 written by different people in your view? Is that where you're coming to?
Okay, Howie, don't steal my thunder, please.
Oh, okay. I'll be quiet. But I think I'm on the right trail.
Okay. The answer is, okay, I hope nobody will turn off their screen now, or now I'm in big trouble. Okay, the answer is, Howie, on the nose.
Okay.
On the nose.
Keep going then.
All right.
Okay.
So here goes. Okay, so the trees. A river issues from Eden to water the garden. Okay, so there's a river that comes through, God has some choice land. There's even a river that runs through it. And then divides and becomes 4 branches. Okay, this is quite a river. It's not, just a little, what's that, Hatfield Creek that Brittany and some of the other streets cross. I thought that was the Pine Brook, but they tell me it's Hatfield Creek. Okay. So the name of the first branch is Pishon. Never been there to my knowledge. The one that winds through the whole land of Havilah. Okay. I used to read that as through the land of Halava, but okay, I realized I was reading a little too fast. Okay, where the gold is. Okay, I don't know. Maybe it's California. This is Sutter's Creek. That's where the Pishon is. That's where the gold is. Or it could be Alaska or anywhere there's a gold rush. Okay, but let's see. Okay, well, let's pass that. The name of the second river is Gihon, the one that winds through the whole land of Cush. Anybody know where Cush is? Cush is, what's it? No, not even the right continent. How's that? Okay, this must be quite a river when you figure out Cush. Usually, I realize it changes its place. Cush is usually a reference to Ethiopia. So here is a river that goes from the Garden of Eden, which Marlene tells me is in the Middle East, okay, that goes all the way to Ethiopia. Okay, don't know of such a river. Even if the Nile were to take a turn to the northeast, but it was okay. The name of the third river, here we go, for anybody who's been to 7th grade geography class. The name of the third river, anybody want to guess?
Tigris.
Begins with a Tigris. Oh, you're okay. And it flows east to Ashur, which is the word name we use for Assyria. Okay, which usually is Syria, Iraq, that sort of thing. And the fourth river, if the third was the Tigris, anybody want to take a guess at what the fourth one was?
Euphrates.
Euphrates. Okay, 7th grade geography. Okay. So wait a minute. So we can somehow get our bearings on where the Garden of Eden was. Obviously, it's somewhere on a river that flows to the Tigris and the Euphrates River. That first river, the one that goes to Ethiopia, is, I don't know, is really a killer. It's a non-starter for us. But anyway, you're starting to get specifics in this second story. And in this second story, so I say, is God focused on a particular place or a particular area in terms of creation? Okay, Marlene, go ahead. Where's he focused? Where's God?
Focused on the Middle East.
Middle East, sure. Right now, apparently
Alaska, because you couldn't have lush gardens in Alaska.
Right.
So why did he focus on that particular area of the world when there was no world then? He was first creating it.
Right. So I'll tell you what, let's give it a try. Why that section of the world? I don't think that's a trick question either.
It's important now in everything. And the land and Egypt, Israel.
Let's speak in terms of the known world at that time.
Yeah, it was the known world. It was the focus of society, of civilization. That was their world. That was it.
I'll tell you, I don't know for people. G Bob, this might be a question for you, because for people, if you're heading down towards Rutgers, okay, on 287, I'm not sure which exit it is, but there's a sign that says on an exit sign, let's see,
Zarephath.
Yeah, okay. How's it pronounced, Bob?
Zarephath.
Zarephath. Okay. I don't know if I've ever been there, but I've probably driven past. Okay, I see that from the time I first took 287. I don't know where I was going, but I was heading in that direction. I see it. I go, wow. Okay, now this is probably one of all those things that, a rabbi would say, wow, Zarephath, never heard of it. What's Zarephath? Okay, I should have done a little more homework. In one of the prophets, I forget which prophet in the Bible, speaks about that Zarephath is sort of like the limits to the world. You can go as far as Zarephath, and then you're going to fall off the edge of the earth. That's not the quote. Don't say that's a quote because I forget exactly what the quote is, but it hints that Zarephath is pretty far. It's like Yenemveld or, East Oshkosh or, something like that. Okay. It probably was, knowing what the known world was at the time of that prophet, it was probably one of the Greek Isles. Okay. It wasn't that far in the Mediterranean from Israel. But Zarephath is a long way. It's like you can take a cruise, you can take a 3-day cruise, you can take a 7-day cruise. It depends on how much time you have and how far from port you want to go. So Zarephath was probably as far as most people were willing to navigate on the Mediterranean, wherever it was. Again, as I said, most people think it's one of the Greek Isles. Okay. When Jews were sent by Rome to Gaul, okay, in Roman times, that was pretty far. Gaul was further than the Greek Isles, and it was probably as far as the Romans could send any Jew in the known world. How far you go? Gaul. That's when you fall off the edge of the earth, when you get past Gaul. And so Gaul became Zarephath, or in Hebrew, we pronounce it a little differently. It's that the Z is a tzadi and the TH is a tav. And so what Zarephath becomes Zarephat. Okay, Zarephat is Zarephath. It's a Hebrew name that whoever said Zarephath anglicized it. Today, if you say you're going on a trip to Zarephat, you're not going to Zarephath. Zarephath is exit such and such on 287. Today, Zarephath is the nation of France. France is Zarephath because it was Gaul. That was as far as people went. And in modern times, Gaul became France. So every time I go past that sign, it's like, if only getting to France was so easy. Of course, if you're sitting on the weekend traffic on 287, getting to Zarephath should only be that easy. So, so here we have these 4 rivers, and it's hard to pinpoint it.
Virtual facts take longer too.
It was the known world at that time. And so it probably was the Middle East. And Marlene, Marlene, did you make the comment about the trees? That
Yes.
it's okay. That it could be like the old joke. It could have been like the Gobi Forest. You say, you don't mean the Gobi Forest, you mean the Gobi Desert. And I say, yeah, now. Okay. That there is a theory that I read an article once upon a time. If I can find it, I'll tell you what, Rosalie, if you could mute, please.
Yeah.
Okay. So the the forest.
No, it's coming.
Okay.
Oh, I'm getting out. I can't stand this.
All right. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm gonna get out.
Okay. That with the forest, there's a theory. I know that there's a theory that somehow there are people. There's some scholar wrote that the Garden of Eden was Bahrain. Now I don't know if it was a case of forget about the forest, forget about the river, go where the money is. But whatever it was.
Yeah.
So, but I would say the safe money, as far as I'm concerned, that they believed that the Garden of Eden was probably somewhere in Mesopotamia. Carol, did you say that a long time ago? So, and as far as that river that goes all the way to Egypt, to Ethiopia, I don't know. But so that's okay. That's story one. And so Howie will come back to what I mean in terms of two versions. Now I'm going to go to the story of Noah.
Can I ask you a quick question before you go on?
Sure.
Maybe I'm misreading this, but when you were reading about, God planted a garden in Eden, which seems like he physically did it.
Yep.
But then a line or two later, it said he caused to grow every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food. And that doesn't seem like he physically planted it. So
Right.
my question is, why does he therefore need to plant first and then just go poof, it's there?
My guess is that they understood that there were probably certain things that just by having some sunlight, some water, and some earth can grow. If you have a piece of land, the weeds will grow. Some things will, you'll even have the seeds that are in the wind that out of nowhere, I see a maple tree, is because the wind blew the seeds. Nobody planted that tree, I almost assure you. And they saw that there were other things that need a certain amount of caring. And by the time they got to writing this story, that they saw that, gee, how did grain fields begin? How did fruit trees begin? Why are they in some places and not in other places? And it's one of those, like, only God can make a tree. So that I think they understood that if you put a sprinkler system in a well that comes up and you get water and ground and sunlight, even though I'm not sure if they knew about sunlight, but let me assume they did, you can get growth. But if you want a particular type of growth, that takes wisdom, and God is the source of wisdom. So if God was there at the beginning, it must have been somehow God's wisdom. But it doesn't say God said. It just says, that somehow God did it, but it doesn't give us much of a description. So let me leave it at that.
Okay, so I have another question before we
Okay.
go on. All right, so we've established that it's the Middle East. Why did God decide to set the setting to be the Middle East and the Garden of Eden? Why there and not somewhere else?
Okay. Let me.
Sorry, Rabbi.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's right. I guess on something like that, I sometimes think of the Mormons. I said, we talked about, we joked, Brooklyn, Bayside, or maybe you weren't joking. That let's take the Mormons. That the Mormons started with, John Smith in upstate New York. The Mormons, that he goes west, that he's in Illinois for a while, and then eventually gets to Utah. And in the Mormon story, eventually the Holy Land has to become Utah. That's their experience. You can't tell a story, at least the Mormons shouldn't be telling a story that, oh my God, the promised land is upstate New York and John Smith goofed, gavalt, okay? That we tell the story that Abraham started from Mesopotamia and eventually his descendants came to the promised land that we know as Israel. We joke, Florida is the other promised land or something like that, but it's Israel. That when, what does Leora say? Something about that genealogy is ideology. I would say geography is also ideology. That when we're talking about a particular place, it's not just the 7th grade geography class, which hopefully is somewhat objective. It's trying to sell you a piece of land, right? And if they said that the Garden of Eden was Israel, anybody who's been to the Negev say, come on. Or if if the Israel was the Garden of Eden, why has the JNF been planting all these trees all these years? But if you go back to the Tigris and the Euphrates, and you see, first of all, you have a sense that that's where our ancestors came from. And two, that in good periods of time, the Tigris and Euphrates can be quite a center of culture and not a bad place to live either. Might be a little hot, might be a little dry, but somehow the Tigris and the Euphrates have made it quite reasonable, at least for people who don't mind a Mideastern climate. So I think it was what they knew, like every writer is supposed to write about what they know about. And eventually the story will meander to something that'll be believable. Saying the Garden of Eden was in Israel wasn't believable, even to ancients. But saying the Garden of Eden was somewhere on the Tigris and Euphrates could be. We got a lot of things from there. We got mathematics from there. We actually have a story about brain surgery that was being done in ancient Mesopotamia. We don't know if the patient lived or not, but they knew that there was a relationship to the brain. They knew a lot of stuff. So why not say that if we say that the source of all knowledge is God, let's say the source of all knowledge is where God first touched the earth. Okay, and I say that in a very euphemistic way. I don't mean literally, but maybe I do. I don't know. Okay, so let me leave it at that so I can go on. Okay.
Thank you.
Very welcome. So now I want to go to Noah. Okay. This is just one question. This is a pass-fail. All right, one question. Okay. How many animals of each kind did Noah bring on the ark, or was he supposed to bring on the ark? Okay, so 2. Okay, anybody who saw Richard Rogers' 2x2, it's even been on Broadway. All right, 2. All right, fine. Let me read. Just in case anybody wants to follow, I'm reading Genesis chapter 6, verse 17. Let's see. For my part, this is God speaking, if you couldn't guess already. For my part, I am about to bring the flood, waters upon the earth, destroy all flesh under the sky. Okay, if you're going to talk, you got to mute, please. To destroy all flesh under the sky in which there is the breath of life. Everything on earth shall perish. Okay, we know that on the story. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark with your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives, and of all that lives, of all flesh, you shall take 2 of each into the ark to keep alive with you. They shall be male and female. So far, so good. Okay, we get the pass-fail. From birds of every kind, cattle of every kind of creeping thing on earth, 2 of each shall come to you to stay alive. For your part, take of everything that is eaten and store it away to serve as food for you and for them. Noah did just so, as God commanded. He did.
Yeah, I want to take my shoes off anyway.
Okay, Don, if you're going to speak, I'm going to ask you to
Oh,
mute.
I'm sorry, Reverend. I'm sorry, Reverend.
Okay. I hear everything, and my guess is everybody else can too. Thank you. Okay. 7. I'm going to go to chapter 7 of Genesis. Let's see. And the Lord said to Noah, go into the ark with all your household, for you alone have I found righteous before me in this generation. Okay. Of every clean animal you shall take. Anybody know what the number is that follows?
7.
7. Okay. 7 pairs, male and their mates. And of every animal that is not clean, 2, a male and its mate. For the birds of the sky also 7 pairs, male and female, to keep seed alive upon the earth. Okay, good. Now, you'll say, well, wait a minute, Rabbi. First, God said 2. What do you expect? Okay. And then God explained it a little better and said 2, and then some 7. But he says it when Noah's supposed to go into the ark. If I had put all my faith in Noah, I would probably give him a good orientation, as good an orientation as I can. My guess is, okay, 2. Okay, 2. Maybe Noah could manage his time better than I could. Somebody says, get 2 of every animal. Okay, and I'm thinking, 2, get 2, get 2, get 2. Oh, here are 2 geese, 2 worms, 2 goats, 2 whatever. Okay, I got 2. God's going to be really happy, 2. And then all of a sudden God says, and for some I want 7. Oh my God, why didn't you tell me that before? If you could tell me 2, why couldn't you tell me 7? Okay, give me a break, God. Okay? If my screen goes bad, I've obviously crossed the line in terms of what I say. Okay? But it's like, now he tells me, or she tells me, 7. Like, okay, it's tough to be the humble servant of God. And I don't know if anybody ever saw 2 by 2 on Broadway. Okay, so, and the original cast, that Noah was played by Danny Kaye. So anybody who's ever seen Danny Kaye in terms of improvising and just doing, his comic shtick while he's supposed to be reciting lines, that, you figure when he gets exasperated with God, you can see somebody who gets exasperated with God and let you laugh at it, so we don't all get struck down by lightning. Okay. So that's the Noah story. So it's not a simple pass-fail of 2. Okay, it's 2 with an asterisk. Some need 7. And not only that, but Noah got that information relatively late in the game. Okay, not my problem. Obviously, I live a few thousand years later.
The
Third
rabbi
story-
said 7 pairs, so there are 2 in a pair.
Right. Well, that obviously, right, that he felt that for anything that was kosher, right, the kosher menu had to have, more to it, more stuff on it. So it's like, if it were worms, get 2 worms. Okay. I don't know biology. I don't know if there is a male or female worm. Okay. If it's a chicken, okay,
It's a chicken.
right. Or if it's a goat, let me deal with goats. Let me deal with mammals, at least what I know. Okay. Goats, 7 goats, 7 male goats, 7 female goats. Okay. Make sure, because if you're going to keep kosher, you got to make sure that there's enough meat in the refrigerator. Okay. Or at least in the pantry. So that's that. Third story. Okay. You'll say, gee, finally, here's a third story. I'd like to do the story of Joseph and his brothers, not the whole story. That also was on Broadway, as everybody knows. So I want people to tell me, aside from Joseph, who everybody despised, okay, who was the most influential of the remaining brothers of Joseph? Okay, that's question number 1. And question number 2, I'll give it 2A and 2B. Who is the most influential, and how do we know that? Okay, that's 1A and 1B. And question number 2 is, okay, who did Joseph get sold to by his brothers? Okay, who were the lucky recipients, the lucky buyers of Joseph? Okay, here we go. I'm going to read from Genesis chapter 37. And I'm going to start at verse 18 in case anybody wants to follow along. Okay. Joseph is going to meet his brothers. They saw him from afar, and before he came close to them, they conspired to kill him. Just give me a sense. Okay. They said to one another, "Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits." And we can say a savage beast devoured him. We shall see what comes of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he tried to save him from them. He said, let us not take his life. And Reuben went on, shed no blood, cast him into the pit in the wilderness, but do not touch him yourselves. Intending, now this is like where you look at the screen, intending to save him from them and restore him to his father. Back to the story. When Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the ornamented tunic that he was wearing, and took him. It didn't say many-colored coat. It was an ornamented tunic. And there's another scholar who makes it a long sleeve coat. It was long sleeves. What did he care about stripes? An ornamented tunic he was wearing, and took him and cast him into the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. They sat down to a meal. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, their camels bearing gum, balm, and ladanum, to be taken to Egypt. Okay, so I read the story. Okay, who is the most influential brother?
Reuben.
Reuben. Okay, anybody know where Reuben was in the birth order?
Isn't he the oldest?
He's the oldest. Okay, that makes sense. He's the oldest. You'd listen to everybody. If anybody's going to listen to anybody, it's going to be big brother. And what does he say? He says, put him in the pit, don't hurt him. And then he says, he mumbles to himself, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to save him and I'm going to send him back to Dave. Okay? So that's how we know Reuben is the most influential and had a plan. And they listened to him. They put him in the pit and he was going to come back for him. But I'm going to keep reading. Verse 26. Then Judah said to his brothers, what do we gain by killing our brother and covering up his blood? Come, let us sell him to Ishmaelites, but let us not do away with him ourselves. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh. His brothers agreed. Okay, so wait a minute. Maybe Reuben wasn't listened to after all. They put him in the pit, but why do we have another story. Who's the brother that steps forward?
Judah.
Judah. Okay. And let me ask, anybody know where Judah is in the birth order?
No, I'd have to start counting.
He's number 4. He's number 4. But what does Judah have for yichus that Reuben doesn't have? And when I say yichus, let me say forward yichus. Where can I find Reuben's descendants today? A trick question. Don't know.
So they, yeah.
Right.
Were they
Reuben's,
part of the lost tribes?
they are the part of the lost tribes. Reuben is nobody. Okay. Nobody knows who his great grandchildren are. But who are Judah's progeny?
One of the 10 tribes of Israel, no?
Okay. The remaining tribes. That's us. Okay. Now, this could be a version of my dad is better than your dad. Okay. That it makes sense to say the oldest came with some wisdom and they listened to him. But then somebody might have said, who listens to Reuben? Even his children don't listen to him. His children aren't around anymore. Nobody knows who they are. Judah. Everybody knows who's a Jew. Okay. Whether they're Jewish or they're not Jewish, they know who a Jew is. And that's why Judah makes it into the picture. Okay. So the question is Ruvain the most influential or is Judah the most influential? Not quite sure. They seem to be saying the same thing. I'm not sure who listens to whom, but at least it's food for thought. But who did they sell to? They sold to the
Ishmaelites.
Ishmaelites. Not so fast. not so fast. And I realize this is the desert, okay? You can see people coming from miles away. It's not like they're hiding behind the trees. You know, anybody who's seen any movie about Rommel and, you know, Ella Alamein and whatever, that sure you can see where the tanks were coming from. But here we go. Verse 28. When Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph out of the pit. And they sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites who brought Joseph to Egypt. Now I'm confused. Midianites took him out of the pit, and somehow still the Ishmaelites got the money? I don't get it. Okay. Maybe the Ishmaelites and the Midianites were related. I don't know. You know, it's like saying the Persians and the Iranians. Okay, at one time it was called Iran, at another time it's called Persia. But the stories that we have in the Bible, most of them are the Midianites, who are the ancestors of Zipporah, Moses' wife, and the Ishmaelites, who are the descendants of Ishmael, Isaac's half-brother, are two distinct people. Okay, I don't know. This might be as what they call the text is garbled. Okay, Reuben, Judah, Ishmaelites, Midianites, not sure. I still have a lot of question marks. Don.
Rabbi, is it possible that Judah told the Ishmaelites that, hey, there's somebody in the pit that you can have for 20 bucks?
And anything is possible. The problem is the story is scant on the facts. Right? And that's so based on the facts that we have, I'm gonna go with Howard's thesis, right, that there were two stories. There were two stories.
Eric,
Maybe there were two stories.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
Artistic license, whatever the editor wants to do.
Artistic license, but the fact is that I have to. You're a good class, but sometimes I have. Okay, I go to a evangelistic church, and they want to know where it's written, and I have to come up with an answer in the text, and I can't tell them. I can't tell them that the rabbis of the Talmud taught us. They'd say, oh, Pharisees. Nobody listens to Pharisees. I can't believe, Rabbi, you do. And then I'll say, to be honest, rabbis are Pharisees. We are the descendants of the Pharisees. And we invited you to our church. And they'll say, Oi, Gewalt. Right? So that's they want to know. They want to see, you know, where is es geschrieben? Okay, the Bible. Okay, so I can say the rabbis, the Pharisees said, or I can say, you know, there were a bunch of medieval rabbis who wrote commentaries and tried to fill in the blanks, and they'd say, you know, and I'll be very critical. You know, I do a lot of interfaith stuff, but they'd say, you know, we've never really trusted any Jew after St. Peter. So maybe St. Paul. Okay, so those rabbis of the rabbis of the Talmud, most of them babkas as far as they're concerned. And the rabbis of medieval times, oh, please. Okay, so the documentary hypothesis is just what Howard said, that there was more than one story to some of these pieces. Not only the stories, but even in terms of the laws, that somebody put it one way and somebody put it the other way. And you say, well, how did it get to be? And the answer, you know, this is like Fiddler on the Roof, where he says, you know, and how do we keep our balance? That I can tell you in one word. What's the word? Tradition. Right. Bob, okay, right. from Tevye's mouth, right? That it's that that, and then they go for 10 minutes explaining what tradition is, that we all have a role in life. There are papas, there are mamas, there are sons, there are daughters, and there's there's the rabbi, there's the beggar, there's the
The
sheriff,
matchmaker
the constable,
and the others.
right, and the others. So there are a lot of people who have roles in life. But then, okay, then Tevye looks forward and he says, and how did these traditions begin?
I don't know.
Don't know. Okay. And so in terms of these stories, how did these stories get to be? I'm not sure. We don't know. And certainly the rabbis of the Talmud and the medieval rabbis tried to fit it together as best they could. Occasionally, there is a rabbi, most of the time, when you say, who rabbi? I want names. Give me names. Most of the time, it was usually Nachmanides, okay, a Spanish rabbi, who seems to say these things like, he says, the person who understands. It's sort of like a word to the wise is sufficient. Okay, and you say, what was he saying? And then sometimes he puts it a little differently. He says, the person who understands will keep quiet. Right? So it's like, I don't want to be a revolutionary, but when you look at some of this stuff, not all of our explanations fit all the time. The rabbinic explanation only goes so far. And so there were, and I'm going to continue it next time, but there were certain Jewish sources, certain rabbis, and some Jewish non-rabbis who said, I believe that they probably had more than one story to go with. And then once it got into Christian hands, they said, we heard from some Jews that there was more than one version. And that's one of the reasons. So I'm going to say something that Christians might say, and that's why we need a New Testament, because that old one, it doesn't always fit. There were a lot of questions about it. It is suspect in many ways. Yeah, especially if you're a Christian, it's suspect in many ways. If you're a Jew, you try to fit it together and make that puzzle work. But as that idea gets to the Christians, yeah, it's wild. The Old Testament, it's the Old Testament. What do you expect? That's why we have a New Testament. And I'm going to add another layer. And when you get to the point, and I realize it didn't take too much in Christian history to know that there was a certain amount of anti-Semitism. So when you have Christian anti-Semites, if you pull out the whole base on which an understanding of the Torah is put, they couldn't be happier. And that's why I gave you that essay, The Torah, and talked about a guy by the name of Julius Wellhausen. Wellhausen was a German Protestant scholar at the time of Bismarck. I realize that Bismarck was before the Holocaust, but anybody who thinks that Germany loved its Jews, or all of Germany loved its Jews before the Holocaust, is sadly mistaken. Not only that, but Wellhausen was able to push anti-Semitism on a whole new level through theology. If you can say that the Torah is corrupt, the Torah is a fake, the Torah is a story that just doesn't fit. Okay, it's a lot of stories that are just out there. You say, you're right. Who in their right mind would want to be a Jew Who in their right mind would want to believe the Torah and say, this is what makes the world run? And so in many ways, this documentary hypothesis that Wellhausen was able to source out, he went through the whole Torah and said, you know, to the best of my knowledge, I believe that there were either 4 authors or 4 schools of thought, we can call them a committee, that wrote the Torah. There was one group that came from the tribe of Judah. Let's call them the J document. Not only that, they're not J just because they came from Judah, but their favorite name for God was Yud Hey Vav Hey. Okay, can everybody picture a Yud Hey Vav Hey in your mind? That Yud Hey Vav Hey is the word that they taught us in Hebrew school. How are we supposed to pronounce it?
I don't know.
Adonai. That's the word. I know it doesn't say Adonai. I know it doesn't spell Adonai. But your Hebrew teacher told you whenever you see that, say the word Adonai. Instead, you probably said, what does the Hebrew teacher know? Okay. I'm a person of science. I'm going to figure it out. It sounds something like Yehovah. Okay, I'm glad my screen didn't go blank this time. It's supposed to be a name only pronounced by the Kohen Gadol, okay, on Yom Kippur. And Finkel says it. Okay, well, the truth is, at least according to Finkel, that isn't how it was pronounced on that day, in those days. When the temple stood in Jerusalem, okay, the Vav was not pronounced like a V. Okay, most scholars are willing to go along with that. Not only that, but then you have Jehovah's Witnesses who say, oh, and the closest thing we have to a Yud is a J. So Jehovah. So Jehovah, Yehovah, whatever it was, that they were from Judah and they like to call God Adonai. Okay. That's how you can probably tell that you're dealing with a J text. Document number 2, version number 2, is what we're going to call the E document. Okay. E, there's that Town Motors in Denville that always says, they have E something, email, E whatever. Okay. So E, why E? Because it's from the tribe of Ephraim. Okay. So if anybody has a Hebrew name, Ephraim. Who was Ephraim? Anybody know who Ephraim was? He was one of the heads of one of the tribes, and his father wasn't Jacob. Okay, so who was his father? And how did he get to be the head of a tribe? Any hands? Oh, okay. Ephraim was Joseph, one of Joseph's sons. So how is he related to Jacob? Jacob was his grandfather. But who was Jacob's favorite? Everybody?
Joseph.
Joseph. And so Jacob decided, it might be more complicated than this, but I'll make it simple. Jacob decided he liked Joseph so much, couldn't talk about not being able to learn a lesson. He lost Joseph for all those years. But when all was said and done, he gave Joseph a double Yerusha, a double inheritance. And we know that in Jewish law, there is a thing that a double inheritance. Gave him a double inheritance, that Joseph's sons would each get as much an inheritance as each of Jacob's sons. So think of it this way, okay? Let's say there are, 3 brothers in a family. I don't want to go into inheritance laws with women. It's not that I want to ignore the women. I want to make this as simple as possible. 3 brothers, okay? 2 brothers have 1 son. 1 brother has 2 sons. rather, and the one that has two sons is not the firstborn. If the grandfather says, okay, I'm gonna divide my estate 4 ways, that each of my grandchildren are gonna get 1/4 of the estate. The sons that only have one son say, whoa, wait a minute. Shouldn't have been that way. My son should have gotten 1/3, not 1/4. My other brother, who has one son, should have gotten 1/3, not 1/4. And the 2 grandchildren that are brothers, they should have only gotten 1/4. They got what they deserved. Sorry, they should have gotten 1/6. I apologize. My math needs a little brushing up. They should have gotten 1/6. Right? So, in other words, Jacob played favorites to his dying day and gave his 2 favorite grandsons a promotion so that they each became part of a tribe, a head of a tribe. And not only that, okay, so here's sort of the punchline. We thought Ruvain was influential because Ruvain was the eldest. In time, Ephraim eclipsed Ruvain. And that's why it's the E document and not the R document. The R document is something else. So Ruvain rides into the sunset. Ephraim is the head of the most influential tribe in northern Israel, and he has a version too. And just to make it easy to remember, what is Ephraim's favorite name for God? Okay, also begins with an E.
Elohim.
Elohim or Eloheinu, sure. When you see that Elohim, Eloheinu, that's Ephraim. Likes that Aleph, likes that E in God's name. Makes him know that he's close to God. Just like Judah thought that Jehovah, the Yud, Yehuda, and whatever God's name was, Yud, it matched. In time, there was a king by the name of Josiah. Okay, some may know him, some may not. He was the king in 621 BCE. Josiah was an amazing king. He had a grandmother who was the Wicked Witch of the West. She was not only the Wicked Witch of the West, she was the Wicked Witch of the East. She was the Wicked Witch, and what was worse, as you can imagine, the grandmother of the king, she was queen. What made her so terrible? Well, if you're asking me, psychologically speaking, what made her so terrible? I don't know. But historically speaking, I'll let you know. She killed all of her children. She wanted to hold on to the throne. Okay, you know, we say, when is Queen Elizabeth going to pass the throne along to Prince Charles? You know, it's been a running story ever since we can remember, ever since Prince Charles was born. Okay, so we don't know. We still to this day don't know, you know, if Prince Charles is going to be king someday or not. Who knows? Probably Elizabeth knows, but we don't know. That Josiah was a grandson. And the Kohanim, when they saw what Queen Atalia did to her children. Okay, does somebody have 2 sources? Okay, I don't know. Well, anyway, did what Queen Atalia did to the children, the Kohanim kidnapped the pick of the litter of Atalia's grandchildren, a guy by the name of Josiah, and hid him from his grandmother so that she didn't get a chance to kill him too. And when Atalia finally came to her end, the Kohanim and people said, oh, there's no one to lead us. Atalia killed all of the inheritors of the throne. And the Kohanim said, Not so fast. Okay. We took one of her grandsons, Josiah, who we believe is a promising youngster, and we hid him. He is going to be the next king. Well, there was a lot of work to do on Josiah's part. And when Josiah was king, he said to the Kohanim, look, I'll tell you what, I'm a kid. I don't know this stuff. What I'd like you to do is, I would like you to present the Torah to me. And sure enough, we have a story about the Kohanim come to him with a Torah. And those people who believe in the documentary hypothesis said, that wasn't a Torah that was a J Torah or an E Torah. It was those priests who specifically edited a Torah that they could give to the king, and the king could lay down the law and say, this is what the Torah says. So there was a J version, there was an E version, and there was a P version that the priests at the time of Josiah, that's what they did. And last but not least, okay, after the temple was destroyed, some people tried to put the pieces together of Judaism for those who were going into exile in Babylonia. When Babylon conquered Israel and sent the Jews into exile, they needed a pocket version of the Torah so they could still read the Torah while they were in exile. They couldn't carry around a big scroll or even a medium-sized scroll. They needed something that was to the point. And so we have what's called the D version, the Deuteronomy version, towards the end of the Torah, the sum up of the whole Torah. And so what we're going to talk about is, we're going to talk about what makes up the Torah according to this theory. The J version, the P version, the D version, and the E version, not necessarily in that order. So, Howard, I'm glad you didn't steal all my thunder, or maybe you did, and everybody slept through everything after you said it. But that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to show you 3 books that may or may not be part of the downloads that I'm going to send you. From time to time, I'm going to download, and sometimes I'm going to talk about, without downloading, the original book. Who Wrote the Bible? By Richard Elliott Friedman. That I think it's a good book to have. And he says everything better than I say it. But his videos are only little bits and pieces. Otherwise, I do it like we did on Purim. I turn on the video and say, listen to the source, the Harvard doctorate. Okay, that's 1. 2, some of you might say, okay, Rabbi, where do I find this J version? Okay. For anybody who graduated Yale, there was a professor of literature, a guy by the name of Harold Bloom. You can guess by his name, he's Jewish. Okay, I think he's under a cloud. I think he was suspended and eventually let go because of some not nice things that he did to other people. That you didn't necessarily want to be one of his doctoral students. That he was beyond critical. But I bought it used. Okay, so you shouldn't say I was making him rich. That there is a book called The Book of J. Okay, can everybody see it on the screen? I don't know. Okay, so in it, Harold Bloom tries to tell you what was the Book of J. Once we pull it apart, let's put it back together. And if anybody says, I want it. Now, to the best of my knowledge, there isn't a book of E, a book of P, and a book of D. I guess Harold Bloom got fired from Yale before he was ready. But there is a book of J, anybody who's curious. And the third book that I want to show to is this version of the book of Genesis. It's called the Anchor Bible. You can see the picture of the anchor on the cover. And it was written by or edited by, what do you know? The guy, okay, E.A. Spicer. And you'll never guess what E's first name was.
Ephraim?
Ephraim. Okay, right. Ephraim or Ephraim. Okay. He was a professor in Oriental Studies at Penn in the 50s and 60s. I believe he got his PhD from Johns Hopkins. I'm not 100% sure. Some of this biography stuff I make up as I go along, but that's okay. You can always Google it. Went to Johns Hopkins, got his PhD, I believe, from Johns Hopkins, and then became the Bible person or the Old Testament scholar in Oriental Studies at Penn in the 50s and 60s. We'll take those books and I'll leave it at that. I've talked plenty. I've read. So let me ask any questions. Oh, a word to the wise. I'm not going to hold tight, I think, to the subtitles that I had for the remaining sessions. So session 2 isn't going to only be about the book of J, but it's going to be largely about the book of J to make certain points. I will talk about J, I am sure, at almost every meeting. I will talk a little bit about E and D and P a little bit at each meeting. So it isn't going to be as clean cut as some people might like, but you're always very patient with me and understanding and tolerant, all of those wonderful adjectives. And I hope you will be equally patient with me and all of those other adjectives on this also. Enough said. Let me take questions and I'll try to make my answers as concise as possible. Bob, was that a question?
It was a comment. About 30 years ago, the Barn Theater did 2 by 2.
Right.
And in fact, I played Shem.
Okay. It's always good to play the one who is the father of the Shemites. Right. Good. Marlene, was that a question?
Only a thought.
Okay.
The Orthodox,
Right.
not modern Orthodox, but the Orthodox, just
Yep.
the whole thing. How would they ascribe to what you are teaching us?
Okay. Now, as I suppose, I'm not going to cop out on this answer.
I
But
know
I'd
you
say
look up that.
Orthodoxy covers a spectrum. So let me say, I am pretty sure that Rabbi Spalter does not see eye to eye with me on this particular issue. But that's okay. We don't see eye to eye on a lot of issues, most of them Jewish. Right? I would venture to say that, so let me speak in terms of rabbinical schools. That for anybody who knows the Chovavei, it's the rabbinical school that Avi Weiss founded in Riverdale. That people who know Rabbi East at the
White Meadow?
right, no, in Randolph.
Don might know.
Where does
Mount Freedom?
Mount Freedom?
Mount Freedom?
Right. He's at Mount Freedom. So my guess is that Menashe, Rabbi East, knows about this theory. He may or may not buy it. And he may or not feel that it's valid for Bible study, but he knows it. I would say for rabbis who came out of Yeshiva University, they would probably say, the documentary hypothesis, I've heard of it. Okay. I might have read an essay on it, but I'm not clear with all the details I'm a little skeptical. And I'd say anybody more traditional than Yeshiva University will probably say treif. Okay? I can't believe that anybody who calls himself a rabbi, and as an aside, I don't call him a rabbi anyway, would actually peddle this stuff to other Jews. All the more reason that you shouldn't belong to a conservative synagogue, because that's the stuff they talk about, let alone any other non-Orthodox synagogue. So I would say there are very few Orthodox rabbis in the pulpit who share it. They might say, I know a little about it, I do know it, but I don't talk about it in my synagogue. Now, in that first essay that I had about the one that's called the Torah in big letters, interestingly enough, the person who made the documentary hypothesis kosher enough to be acceptable to Jews was an Orthodox scholar. I don't think he was a rabbi, he was a PhD, but he was an Orthodox scholar on the faculty of Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He figured he was an academic, and as academic, any theory deserved an examination. And when people saw that this scholar at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, who went to an Orthodox shul and no other shul, an Orthodox shul, okay, he might have stepped foot into an non-Orthodox shul, but he generally wouldn't go there for a minyan. Okay, the fact that he was willing to examine the documentary hypothesis and debate it and even say it has some validity, wow. Okay, an Orthodox scholar. And in many ways, he was there at the front of the line when many Reform and conservative scholars were still saying treif. That's the irony of ironies, that it really wasn't until the late 1950s, probably the 1960s, that at the Jewish Theological Seminary and at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, they were willing to talk about it openly in class. That Yechezkel Kaufman was already talking about it before that. And one of the reasons why JTS and HUC, the Jewish Theological Seminary and Hebrew Union College, were willing to talk about it were because those rabbis went to Israel and took a class at Hebrew University in Jerusalem with Yechezkel Kaufman and said, wow, here's this Orthodox guy that's willing to discuss it in his class, and we still say it's treif. I guess we should be able to give it a try. And then it didn't take long. It caught fire at the seminary and Hebrew Union College after that, to the point where you probably couldn't be a reputable Bible scholar at Jewish Theological Seminary or Hebrew Union College without saying that this documentary hypothesis has a great deal of validity. And that's why when I began the story about people who went to the Jewish Theological Seminary and dropped out, I know a number of people, my generation, not a lot, but enough, who were in USY. And in USY, let me tell you, I loved USY. In many ways, maybe I wouldn't have become a rabbi if it weren't for USY. So I'm going to use some talk that I hope isn't too improper. That in USY, these kids, they drank the Kool-Aid of the conservative movement, or what they thought was the conservative movement. They never stopped to think that the scholars at the Jewish Theological Seminary talk a different ball game than the rabbis who have to get up on Shabbos morning and give a sermon. They thought whatever their rabbis in shul talked about, that was what it was all about. And then they went to the Jewish Theological Seminary and they had a Bible professor who talked about the documentary hypothesis. And they said, I thought this stuff was treif. And the professors would say, No, no, no. Who said that? And they said, my rabbi who graduated Jewish Theological Seminary in the 1950s said it was treif. And they said, oh no, welcome to the 1960s. Okay. There are a lot of things in the 60s that we wouldn't do in the 50s. And so it became kosher. It became kosher in the Reform movement. But those kids who grew up in the 50s dropped out of JTS, and many of them went to Yeshiva University because the JTS saying it was debatable made their heads spin. Okay, that was a long answer to a short question. I apologize, Marlene.
No, that's
Other
okay. That was interesting. I just, you know, I don't believe that the Bible was literally written by God. So the things that I hear coming from you make sense. But, you know, I don't know what, you know, and what about Orthodox Christians? Do they believe that the Bible was literally sent by God, or that Jesus and his followers wrote the Bible? Well,
Right.
Jesus didn't, forget
Okay.
that. Jesus
So
never
that is, right. So that's why I'd ask everybody, given what I spoke about tonight, to reread the second essay that I gave you. The Documentary Hypothesis, Moses, Genesis, and JEDP. This was written by a very conservative Christian who not only, my guess is, politically and socially was conservative, but was conservative with their Bible scholarship. They say that Wellhausen, this guy, okay, is treif for Christians. If you believe it, I have a bridge that I can sell you in Brooklyn. Okay, they're saying not only are there reasons for Jews not to believe it, but there are reasons for Christians not to believe it. Okay, yeah. It's exciting. You know, people can ooh and ah and say, wow, this might be secret stuff. Okay, so the answer, Marlene, is the Christian world is divided, and each one has their reasons why. There are liberal Christians who don't buy it, and conservative Christians who don't buy it. There are liberal Christians who eat it up, and there are conservative Christians who eat it up. And I'd say there are more varieties than just those four combinations, but I'd leave that to make it simple. And you'll see that the person who wrote this essay on the Torah is explaining why a lot of Christians think that this is the best thing since sliced bread. And this one says, any Christian who would partake in it, you know, deserves to be, I'm gonna say it, even though it doesn't say it here, should be banned from Christianity. Certainly should turn in their ordination. So these are wide spectrums of belief. And and when I say, you know, mismatch, that even in the Jewish community, sometimes it has to be how old you are and when you came through school. The rabbi who was the rabbi in the synagogue where I grew up, he was ordained at Jewish Theological Seminary in 1954. And he came to my synagogue in 1966 and stayed there till long after I was ordained. I remember when I used to go home and from school and have discussions with him, and he'd say to me, they teach this stuff in rabbinical school? I say, yeah, they even teach it in Jewish Theological Seminary. And he would say, wow. He said, look, he said, to be honest, all of the students in my class always had their suspicions, like you say, Marlene, that I've always thought that, yeah, there was something more in terms of an explanation than the rabbis were giving me. Maybe something like the documentary hypothesis. And I would share it. He was a very honest, upfront guy. He said, but I never thought that this would be part of the curriculum that they'd be teaching. Wow. And once he asked me for my syllabus for my Bible classes. He says, let me see what they're really teaching. He says, as you know, he says, the congregation keeps me too busy to really study it. So, we used to do a lot of sharing like that. Other questions or comments?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, Don, your last comment. I'll let you give the last comment, even though I'll
Rabbi,
add
who wrote the King James Bible?
King James. No, it was called the King James because he commissioned it. And I would say that if you were to speak to the person who was actually running the printing press, he probably said it was a combination of God and Jesus Christ our Lord. That sometimes, it's like the Gutenberg Bible. Gutenberg didn't write it, but it was his printing press. So you put your name on it. Like the Klopman diamond, it has the curse. So in some ways, people got their name on it, not because they wrote it, but they were, people who were, commissioned it. So we'll talk about that too.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're very
you.
welcome.
Excellent.
Shabbat
Thank you
shalom
so
to
much.
everyone.
Have a good
Good night.
evening.
Take care.
Thank you,
Okay.
Rabbi.
Stay
Bye.
safe, everybody.
Everyone.
See you in 2 weeks, but I know that next week I'll be with the Friendship Club. So different topic, but having just as much fun.